cop pulls over a black woman in a Mercedes, then handcuffs her, thinking she's nobody. But when she walks into court the next day, she reveals she's a federal prosecutor. And that slap of reality, it's about to bring the whole system down. Pinehurst Avenue, in the heart of Fairborn, Georgia, stood still under the heavy late afternoon heat. The temperature hovered at 94 degrees Fahrenheit, and the asphalt was so hot it distorted a reflection on the hood of a sleek black Mercedes S-Class, just pulled over by a patrol car. From inside the police cruiser, Officer Derek Langford squinted beneath the sun visor, fingers tightening slightly against his thigh. He stepped out with the self-assured gait of a man used to standing on the side of authority. His snug uniform puffed slightly under a sheen of sweat. His eyes scanned the luxury vehicle before settling on the woman behind the wheel, a black woman, hair neatly pinned back, crisp white blouse buttoned to collar, and a Rolex on her left wrist. Camille Reddick, 38, said nothing. Her hands rested calmly on the steering wheel. She watched Derek in the rearview mirror, as if this was nothing more than waiting at a red light. License and registration, Derek said, voice dry as a stone hitting still water. Camille handed them to the already lowered window. No words, no attitude, just a silence thick enough to scrape against his nerves. Derek glanced over the documents. Name, address, clean record. The car wasn't reported stolen. He lingered a few extra seconds, waiting for some slip-up, but there was none. Just a black woman, in a car worth close to $100,000. He folded the papers, looked at her, then muttered, "You know, this car, it's worth more than my house. That's a problem." Camille turned, her voice steady. "I didn't think legal driving was a problem, officer." Her eyes were sharp, not arrogant, but certainly not submissive. The kind of look Derek hated, because it wasn't afraid. And to him, someone like her should have been afraid. "Step out of the vehicle," Derek ordered, his face stretching into a tight-lipped grin. "May I ask why?" "I've provided all my documents. I wasn't speeding. No traffic light violations. Why am I being detained?" He felt heat rush to his ears. It wasn't a question. It was how she asked it, like she was the one evaluating him. He reached for the handle, unlocked the door, and yanked it open. Camille stepped out, tall and poised in her 3-inch heels. The wind lifted the edge of her blouse. She gave a brief glance toward the patrol car's dash cam, then turned and locked eyes with him. "You're making a mistake," she said, her tone oddly calm. Derek didn't respond. He pulled out the handcuffs, the clink of metal sounding like the overture to a humiliation. But Camille didn't resist. Not a cry, not a flinch. "You don't know who I am, do you?" she asked quietly, almost a whisper, as the cuff snapped onto her wrists. Derek smirked. "You think that matters?" But deep down, a flicker of doubt had begun to cut through the solid wall of confidence he'd built in years of policing Riverton Precinct. The click of the cuffs rang out, sharp and final, against the still summer air in Fairborn. Camille Reddick didn't struggle. She tilted her head slightly, keeping her line of sight clear, eyes still fixed on Derek Langford, who stood less than 2 steps away, his hand still trembling slightly for reasons he hadn't yet dared to name. Unease. A gust of hot wind kicked up a blank citation slip, fluttering across the sidewalk. Derek bent to grab it, masking his hesitation with rushed movements. He didn't understand why he felt off balance. She wasn't like anyone he'd arrested before. No shouting, no tears, no squirming, just standing there, straight-backed, gaze steady as midnight water. "Let's go," Derek muttered, gripping her elbow to lead her toward the cruiser. Camille walked with the composure of someone stepping up to a podium, not someone being taken into custody. Even with her hands cupped behind her, each stride was steady. Derek opened the back door and looked down at her, hoping for a flicker of discomfort, but her face was unreadable. "I can get it myself," she said. The softness of her tone stopped his hand mid-air. Camille turned, dipped her head slightly, and sat in the back seat like she was heading into a high-stakes board meeting. He slammed the door shut. The sound echoed in his chest, not from force, but from the feeling of breathlessness. At the Riverton Precinct, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Camille was led into the temporary holding room. She didn't glance around like most people brought down that hallway. No one had eyes like hers, calm, assessing, as if she were appraising the place itself. Derek Langford stood outside the holding cell, looking into the small reinforced window. Camille Reddick sat on a metal bench, wrists still cuffed, back resting against the wall, eyes fixed forward like she was waiting for her name to be called in the conference room. He turned to the desk, pulled up the registration file, and flipped open her personal information. Name, Camille Renee Reddick. Age, 38. Address, Fairborn Heights, one of the most upscale residential neighborhoods in the county. Occupation, blank. He frowned, flipping through additional pages, but nowhere did it state what she did for a living. Still, everything checked out. The car was registered to her. License clean. No violations in 15 years of driving. A voice called out from the desk across the room. Officer Joel Mercer, Derek's colleague of over 6 years, spoke up. You sure about this? Her record spotless. I double-checked. This doesn't feel right. Derek's reply came low and tight. She was uncooperative. Joel squinted, tilting his head toward the observation window. Uncooperative? Or just unafraid? Derek said nothing. He just kept replaying Camille's words in his head. You don't know who I am, do you? And the terrifying part was, she was right. He didn't. But he was beginning to realize that maybe he should. The next morning, gentle sunlight lay across the red tile roof of the Jefferson County Courthouse. But inside, the tension was anything but calm, taut like a stretched wire. Derek Langford entered Courtroom 2 with his usual air of confidence. His uniform was crisply ironed, badge gleaming, eyes carrying a trace of arrogance, as if his hearing was nothing more than formality to put a minor inconvenience behind him. He scanned the room and recognized a few familiar faces from the station, some local reporters from the Fairborn Herald, and several strangers. But then his eyes landed and froze as Camille Reddick walked to the front. Gone was the simple white blouse from the previous afternoon. She now wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, hair pinned in a tight bun at the nape of her neck, heels clicking across the floor like the drumbeat of something about to erupt. She stood tall at the center of the courtroom, her face neither cold nor friendly. Judge Lenora Whitmore had just looked up from a stack of files when Camille began to speak. Your Honor, before we proceed with the defense, I'd like to present one important detail about my identity. Derek narrowed his eyes, heartbeat quickening. I am Federal Prosecutor Camille Reddick, and I will be representing myself in regard to the events of yesterday. The entire courtroom seemed to exhale in silence. A few people blinked. Others turned and whispered. But to Derek, every sound was suddenly sucked from the air. That one sentence, crisp and unforgiving, hit like a living indictment. What? Derek muttered, almost not believing what he'd heard. Camille turned her head slightly, eyes locking onto his paling face. This time, there was no uncertainty, no assumption. This was the gaze of someone prepared to strip away every layer of pretense. And today, she said without raising her voice, we'll be discussing what really happened and what that says about the system this officer represents. Judge Whitmore tilted her head, flipping to the folder in front of her, the surprise and intrigue plainly visible on her face. Ms. Reddick, this is highly unusual, but I'll allow it. However, all arguments must relate directly to the formal charges. Yes, Your Honor. I believe the truth never strays from the charges. Only those who wish to conceal it do. Camille replied, then turned and walked to the defendant's table, now transformed into a stage for a coming reckoning. Derek swallowed hard. His knuckles whitened against his sides. He hadn't realized things would go this far. And now, under the gaze of lawyers, the judge, the press, and even those who had once stayed silent, he was about to face something he'd never prepared for, a black woman who wasn't afraid and who knew the system better than he did. The courtroom fell into a hush as Camille Reddick approached the lectern. At the defendant's table, she stood with the posture of a law professor addressing a class, not someone on trial. But this time, the lesson wasn't a textbook. It was embedded in a traffic stop fueled by bias the day before. Judge Lenora Whitmore gave a small nod, signaling for her to proceed. Camille didn't rush. She opened the leather folder in front of her and pulled out a stack of documents. neatly clipped together. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and sharp like a scalpel dissecting the institution. "My case is not an anomaly. It's one link in a long chain of unchecked abuse of power, deeply rooted racial bias, and systemic failures that continue to define our law enforcement." A reporter from the Fairborn Herald placed a recorder on the bench in front of him. Some members of the audience snapped photos, but Camille wasn't distracted. I was pulled over legally. I provided all my documentation. I didn't resist, and yet I was handcuffed, detained, simply because I'm a black woman driving a luxury car in southern Georgia. Derek Langford, seated less than 10 feet away, lowered his head, his fists clenched, the veins in his neck beginning to bulge. She hadn't spoken his name, but every word she uttered marked a bullet's trajectory, and he was the target. Camille didn't stop. And if this were just a one-time mistake, I wouldn't be standing here today. But I hold not only dashcam footage, I have a file nearly 200 pages thick. She raised a stack of documents to chest height, including internal complaints, unjustified vehicle searches, and unresolved allegations, all tied to Officer Langford. The courtroom buzzed, but Camille remained composed, as if she had anticipated every reaction. To add weight to proceedings, she called a key witness, a 17-year-old black teenager named Reggie Miles, wearing a wrinkled shirt. His voice was soft but firm. "Officer Langford pulled me over around 10 p.m., said it was because my taillight was out, but it wasn't. I asked to call my mom, and he grabbed my phone, searched my car, didn't find anything, then just drove off without a word." Camille nodded, turning to the panel. And there's no mention of this in the report. No footage either, because the body cam that night was marked as malfunctioning. But she wasn't finished. Camille pulled out her phone and projected an audio recording onto the large screen, captured secretly by Reggie's smartwatch. Derek's voice rang out, unmistakable. "Someone like you out here at 10 p.m.? Yeah, you're definitely up to something." The room erupted. The expressions now directed at Derek weren't just surprise. They were outrage. Camille turned back, setting her phone down with a voice still calm, but laced with undeniable authority. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to expose a chronic illness, and if the court refuses to act, the public will." At this point, the trial was no longer about a single wrongful arrest. It had become a full-scale indictment of privilege, prejudice, and systemic apathy in law enforcement. And Camille Reddick, in a tailored suit with eyes that didn't blink, was holding the torch. She didn't allow the silence to linger. As the murmurs died down, she pulled out another stack of papers, this time labeled Exhibit C, Internal Review Reports and Body Cam Logs. "Your Honor," she said, eyes fixed on Judge Whitmore, "what I presented isn't an isolated incident, and the officer behind it, Mr. Derek Langford, is not an exception. He is a product of a system that has enabled this behavior to persist year after year unchecked." Derek Langford, seated at the defendant's table, leaned back into his stiff chair. His tie now felt like it was strangling him. He avoided looking at the screen, but his ears couldn't shut out the truth. The projector flickered on behind Camille. A dashcam video from March of the previous year began to play. A middle-aged black woman named Clarissa Monroe had been pulled over for exceeding the speed limit by 3 miles per hour. In the video, Clarissa politely asked for the reason, to which Derek snapped. "I don't need a reason to protect my community." Clarissa asked, "Which community would that be, officer?" And the camera jolted violently as she was yanked from the driver's seat. Camille paused the footage. The courtroom fell into complete silence. No charges. No citations, no investigation, she said. But one thing was constant, the chilling silence of internal affairs. She walked slowly toward the witness stand, where a young black man named Jamal Kenner, age 24, waited. He wore a white shirt, a slim tie, and bitterness in his eyes. "Mr. Kenner," Camille began, "can you describe what happened on April 17th of this year, when your vehicle was searched without cause?" Jamal nodded, voice steady though low. "I was pulled over just before 11 p.m. My lights were working. My registration was valid. Officer Langford asked me to pop the trunk. I asked why. He said, 'Guys like you always got something to hide.' A gasp rippled through the courtroom. A woman in the gallery raised her hand to her mouth. He searched my whole car. Found nothing. Didn't apologize. Just left. I filed a complaint. But 2 months went by, no one called me back. Camille thanked him, then turned back to the judge, her hand resting on the folder. Your Honor, I hold 43 internal reports that were prematurely closed concerning unwarranted vehicle searches, the majority targeting people of color. 12 of those reports directly name Officer Langford. Derek shook his head slightly, lips pressed into a hard line. Behind him, Joel Mercer no longer looked composed, his expression now a blend of disappointment and disbelief. Camille concluded her presentation. We can no longer treat incidents like this as unfortunate exceptions. We must admit that when exceptions repeat again and again, they become the rule. 3 light taps of the gavel followed. Judge Whitmore called for a recess, but no one moved, because everyone in the room understood what Camille had just exposed wasn't a person. It was a disease, and for the first time, that disease had been called by its name in public. As Judge Lenora Whitmore announced a recess, Derek Langford stepped out of the courtroom like a man trapped in a dream he couldn't wake from. The courthouse hallway was bright under fluorescent lights, but to Derek, everything felt dimmed. Each footstep echoed like a knock coming from inside his own chest. He found a quiet corner near the vending machine, swiped his card, and retrieved a can of Dr. Pepper, but didn't open it. Sweat glistened at his temples. Despite the air conditioning set at 70 degrees, that suffocating feeling, he had never experienced it while wearing the uniform. He was used to power. He understood fear. But today, those eyes in the courtroom hadn't feared him. They had looked at him as a problem. You all right? Officer Joel Mercer had appeared behind him without a sound. He didn't smile. He didn't scold. He just stood there, holding a to-go coffee from the cafe down the street. Derek didn't answer. He just stared at the unopened soda can, then muttered, I didn't think it would go this far. Joel sat down on the nearby plastic chair, leaning back slightly. You really thought she was just some woman driving a Mercedes who got mouthy with a cop? Camille Reddick isn't someone you can control with handcuffs. Derek growled. I followed protocol. She was uncooperative. Joel didn't argue. He gently rotated his coffee cup and spoke slowly. What does uncooperative mean, Derek? That she didn't bow her head? That she spoke like someone who knows the law better than you? Silence. I've had your back for years. Every time something came up, you said it was police instinct. But this time it wasn't instinct. It was bias. The words hit like a punch to the chest. Derek turned away, but couldn't stop the question from slipping out. You see it too? Joel nodded without hesitation. She didn't do anything wrong, Derek. And you know that. In Derek's mind, the puzzle pieces began to shift. Camille's calm eyes as the cuffs closed, Jamal Kenner's steady testimony, Reggie's recording, and Clarissa Monroe's wordless look of disappointment in the dashcam footage. They weren't minor incidents. They were alarm bells he'd been trying to muffle for years. He leaned against the wall, closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of his own breathing. The one thing that still proved he was human, not just a reflex machine in a uniform. I'm not sure I know who I am anymore, Derek whispered. Joel gave his shoulder a gentle pat, then stood up. If you still feel that, then you've still got a chance to change. It wasn't forgiveness. It was an invitation to face himself. And for the first time in years, Derek Langford didn't resist the doubt inside him. He started to listen. A week later, during the final hearing, Courtroom 2 at the Jefferson County Courthouse was packed. The people of Fairborn sat in tense silence. No one breathed too loudly. No one looked away from the bench where Judge Lenora Whitmore prepared to read the verdict. Camille Reddick sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded calmly on the surface. She wasn't wearing a stiff power suit today, but a simple black dress with a high neckline. Dignified, not flashy. Derek Langford stood on the other side, stripped his former swagger. His face showed fatigue. Wait, Judge Whitmore scanned the courtroom, then lowered her gaze to the ruling in front of her. This court has reviewed all the evidence, listened to the witness testimonies, and acknowledged the far-reaching impact this incident has had. not only on the plaintiff, but on the entire Fairborn community. She paused. The actions of Officer Derek Langford, under the circumstances presented, represent a clear abuse of systemic authority, not a singular mishap. A ripple of murmurs spread across the courtroom. But the real breaking point came moments later, when a middle-aged woman in nursing scrubs stood up in the back row and held up a photo. He pulled me over too. I filed a complaint, but no one ever responded. Security moved quickly in her direction, but Judge Whitmore raised her hand to stop them. She looked at the woman and gave a small nod, a subtle gesture, but like fuel to the fire, another person stood. Then another, a college student, a bus driver, an elderly black veteran. All of them had once been the unfortunate exception, and now they were inscribing their own names into a growing public verdict. Back at the bench, Judge Whitmore tapped her gavel lightly. Based on current statutes, Officer Langford's conduct file will be referred to the Georgia State Internal Review Board. While the investigation is pending, he is hereby suspended from all law enforcement duties. Derek's face fell, but Judge Whitmore wasn't finished. In addition, due to the repeated nature of the misconduct patterns, this court orders the Riverton Precinct to immediately implement a comprehensive retraining program focused on bias awareness, ethics and enforcement, and power accountability protocols. Reporters clacked away at their keyboards. Some members of the public offered quiet applause. Derek said nothing. He couldn't, because in that moment, he wasn't just an officer under investigation. He was a living emblem of a system that had grown too comfortable being untouchable. Camille stood, eyes fixed on the judge. There was no triumphant smile, only a subtle nod, a silent thank you that truth had, for once, been validated not by emotion, but by law. After the ruling, the crowd spilled out of the courthouse like a tide. But it wasn't to protest. It was to breathe the air of a new day, one where someone had finally stood up and said, "The system is broken, and it must change." 3 days later, as the media frenzy began to cool, Camille Reddick returned to her office on the 11th floor of the Reddick Justice Initiative, a space filled with sunlight, abstract art, towering shelves of legal books, and sticky notes densely packed on a whiteboard. She was reviewing a civil complaint from the neighboring county when a quiet knock tapped the door. Her assistant, Devin, poked his head in, wearing an unreadable expression. "Ms. Reddick, there's someone here asking to see you. He says it's personal. Derek Langford." The room held still for a beat. Camille raised an eyebrow, closed the file in front of her, and said plainly, "Send him in." Derek entered stiffly, his black dress shoes thudding heavily on the polished wood floor. He wore civilian clothes, a pale blue button-up with sleeves rolled high, hair neatly combed. But to Camille, the man standing before her was entirely different. No handcuffs, no authority, just someone grappling with the task of rediscovering himself. "I won't take much of your time," Derek began, voice lower than usual. "But I need to say something." Camille didn't respond. She just tilted her head slightly, gesturing to the seat across from her. Derek sat down, hands locked tightly together. "I reviewed the full case file. Everything you said. Every face I once brushed past like they were invisible. And I don't know where else to start but with 2 words. I'm sorry." Camille set her pen down. Her eyes weren't cold, but they weren't warm either. She listened without interruption. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Derek continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I just want you to know I won't go back to who I was. I've enrolled in a program with the Unity Circle group. I'm starting over, relearning, listening, facing what I used to ignore." A long silence followed. Camille looked directly at him, a gaze that didn't judge, but measured him against a very real moral scale. She spoke softly. "I don't need an apology, and I definitely don't need regret." She paused, then continued. "Change doesn't begin with words, Derek. It begins with what you choose to do after you walk out that door." Derek nodded. No argument, no excuses. As he stood and turned to leave, he paused at the threshold. "I used to think I was someone who upheld the law. Turns out I never really understood justice. Thank you for forcing me to look again." The door clicked shut behind him. Leaving Camille alone in the quiet room, she gazed out the window. Early summer light pouring over the low rooftops of the city. A breeze stirred the whiteboard behind her, where she once wrote a reminder to herself. Don't raise your voice. Raise your truth. And in that moment, Camille knew an apology alone couldn't change the world. But if someone took even one honest step forward, then the door could still be opened. 3 months after the verdict, Fairborn, Georgia stepped into a summer unlike any before. The small city that once sat silent under the weight of uniformed injustice was beginning to find its voice. And perhaps the most unexpected of those voices belonged to Derek Langford, the man who once embodied blind power, now becoming a familiar face at community forums. In a small meeting room at the Unity Circle Community Center, Derek stood in front of a group of black teenagers, holding a microphone, not to preach or justify, but to share raw, unfiltered, real. I used to think the badge on my chest gave me the right to decide who looked suspicious, he said. But I never learned to see people beyond the color of their skin. The room was tense at first, but as he spoke about the very trial he'd endured, with Camille Reddick leading the charge, his voice cracked. She didn't break me. She made me wake up. A boy in the front row, maybe 16, raised his hand. Were you scared? Standing in that courtroom? Derek nodded, without hesitation. The scariest part wasn't being judged. It was realizing I was wrong, and the whole city knew it before I did. Meanwhile, across town, Camille Reddick was expanding the Reddick Justice Initiative's reform programs. She traveled county by county, academy by academy, holding trainings on professional ethics, implicit bias, and public accountability. A viral video captured her speech at Atlanta Law School. We don't need more laws. We need people willing to enforce them with a heart that understands the value of human dignity. Camille didn't limit her conversations to law students. She invited former inmates, victims of wrongful arrests, even police officers like Derek, so that the next generation would understand justice doesn't live in paperwork alone. It starts with awareness. Since the incident, Camille had received hundreds of thank you letters, interview requests, and book offers. She declined most of them because she believed real change doesn't come from headlines. It comes from quiet conversations in small rooms where people are allowed to tell their stories without being interrupted. 2 different paths. One moved from power to learning humility. The other used her wounds to light a torch for others. They weren't the same, but both understood. To repair a broken system, you don't need to start with guns or laws. You need one person willing to speak, and another willing to listen. One weekend afternoon in Fairborn, golden sunlight blanketed the town's square park like a gentle reminder that what's old doesn't have to be forgotten, only understood differently. Camille Reddick sat on a bench, holding a small notepad, occasionally jotting down thoughts as she watched a group of high school students participate in a community dialogue she helped organize. In the center of the grass stood a circle. Students, parents, a few officers, and among them, a familiar face. Derek Langford, no longer wearing a badge, dressed simply in a polo shirt and khakis, was speaking to a group of teens about their rights and responsibilities during traffic stops. His voice no longer carried the tension of a man holding control too tightly. It was calm, a bit tentative, but honest. A young boy raised his hand. How do you know who's good and who's bad if they all wear the same uniform? Derek pressed his lips together, then glanced at Camille as if borrowing a little strength. By not looking at the uniform, he said, but by watching how they listen to you and how they act when no one's watching. Camille smiled softly, not a victorious smile, but the smile of someone who had once hurt, had stood back up, and now could breathe without bracing. She closed her notebook, stood, and walked toward the circle. A parent recognized her and clapped first. Then others followed, not because of her title, but because of what they saw. 2 people who had once stood on opposite sides, now sitting together to listen, learn, and heal. Camille spoke. I'm not standing here as a prosecutor or a victim. I'm standing here as someone learning how not to be angry with those who once couldn't understand me. Derek nodded once more. And I'm here as someone relearning how to be human, not just an officer, but a citizen. There may never be a perfect ending to this story, No cinematic justice bell ringing. No final speech that brings a room to its feet. But there is this footsteps headed in the right direction. Camille never wanted to be a symbol. Derek didn't need full forgiveness. They both understood. Hero and villain aren't permanent titles. They're just moments. What matters more is what we choose to do after those moments pass. And in Fairborn, a town once silent, there were now small but certain sounds. Children asking questions about justice. Officers choosing to ask before assuming, and footsteps, steady, human, unfinished, of people learning to be better day by day.